Sorry. Just let us know when we're ready.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Jazakumullah khairan everyone for joining us. Mullah Saleh is no stranger to us, mashallah. As he's been going through the history of the Mughal Empire and the different rulers that ruled, mashallah. He's here today to discuss the Masnavi of Mawlana Rumi rahmatullahi alayhi. And with him is brother Walid, who's coming here from Toronto. He was born in Toronto, where he grew up listening to his father recite and explain first Farsi ghazals at home. His father's influence eventually inspired him to explore the intersection of art, literature, and Islamic mysticism. Walid obtained his bachelor's from the University of Toronto, majoring in Near and Middle Eastern civilizations and political science. His interests have led him to poetry and Islamic thought in the ancient cities of Central Asia, where New Persia emerged a millennium ago. Outside of his full-time pursuit, Brother Walid is involved with Ummah Nabawiya Masjid in Toronto. So if you guys, without further ado, inshallah, bismillah, I'll hand it over to them and they will begin.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillah wa kafa wa salamun ala man la nabiyya ba'dah wa la ummata ba'da ummatihi wa la kitaba ba'da kitabih wa la shari'ata ba'da shari'atihi wa la sahabata ba'da sahabatihi. أما بعد فقد قال الله تبارك وتعالى في القرآن المجيد والفرقان الحميد بعد أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم يا أيها الناس اتقوا ربكم إن زلزلة الساعة شيء عظيم وقال النبي عليه أفضل الصلوات وأكمل التحيات وأزكى المباركات عليه السلام وإن من البيان لحكمة وإن من الشعر لسحرا عليه الصلاة والسلام. Thank you guys so much for coming. We are incredibly blessed to start this up. The thought and the life and the poetry of Hazrat Mawlana Jalaluddin Balkhi Rumi, Qaddasallahu Sirrahu al-Aziz. There was a time in the world where his thought was so universal, all the way from Bosnia to Bengal. The amount of commentaries on just the Masnavi of Mawlana Rumi sitting in the library of Hyderabad, the Salar Jung Museum, hundreds and hundreds, untouched, unedited. This was a civilization, this was a figure that symbolized the beauty, the joy, the intellectual vitality of Islam for 800 years. So much so that both in Mughal India and in the Ottoman Empire, there was a separate mansab, a station called the Masnavi Khan, or the one who recited the Masnavi. And with that in mind, I wanted to just really quickly read Tanwi. Everyone knows who he is. He wrote an 8-volume commentary on the Masnavi of Mawlana Rumi. And before he started, he started off with some lines in Urdu. If that's okay, I'm just going to read it. He says, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Ba'd alhamdu wa salah. अर्ज़ है कि आजकल अक्सर तबक़ात के लोगों को मसनवी मौलाना रूमी अलैहि रहमत से एक ख़ास दिलचस्पी है, मगर नावाक़िफ़ी फ़न की वजह से उसके मज़ामीन समझने में अक्सर गलतियाँ करते हैं। और चूँकि उसके हवाशी और शुरू अक्सर या तवील या ज़्यादा है या दक़ीक़ है और बाज़ असले मतलब से दूर है या उसूल शरईय्या से गुज़रे हुए हैं, इस सबब से वो उनके रफ़अ ज़रूरात के वास्ते काफ़ी नहीं समझे जा सकते। इसलिए उसकी हाजत मालूम हुई कि मसनवी मौसूल की एक मुख्तसर शर्ह उर्दू ज़बान में लिख दी जावे, जिसमें असले मतलब या जिस मसाइल पर असले मतलब मौकूफ है, वगैरह वगैरह. And then he says, وهو الموفق والمعين في كل أمر وفي كل حين. And the fact that Mawlana Tanwi, being such a significant and brilliant figure of the South Asian Islamic tradition, took out time to write 8 volumes of a commentary shows that this book is not, your average book. This has a lot of value to any Muslim living between Istanbul and Delhi, and so much more. There's so much more to say. I want to pass it off to Waris, who will give us a pase manzar, a background, a life history, a social history of Hazrat Mawlana Jalaluddin Balkhi Rumi. Please, Bafarwai.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. Thank you very much. Thank you, Brother Hamza and Mawlana Saleh and everybody for coming today. It's a pleasure to be here with you from Toronto. And it's my first time in Chicago, and I must say, it's been great so far. Thank you very much for that introduction. I think we're going to start off, like Mawlana Saleh said, with just a brief look at Mawlana Rumi's life, the context that he was born in, the context that he was raised in, the context which he existed in and transitioned through. And then we'll talk a little bit about the Masnavi al-Ma'nawi, which we have here. And then we'll actually go ahead and recite some of the poetry and provide some commentary. So when we get into that, Mawlana Saleh will actually read for us the original Farsi. I'll read an English translation, and then inshallah we'll go through line-by-line commentary of the first section of the Masnavi Ma'nawi. So Mawlana Jalaluddin Rumi Balkhi was born in Balkh in present-day Afghanistan, known at that time as al-Bilad. It was a great center of Islamic knowledge and learning, amongst many other cities in that region of Central Asia today and beyond. And he was born to Sultan Bahauddin Walad, who was himself a giant in the field of Islamic sciences and scholarship. He was a scholar himself and a very renowned one, the most renowned one in Balkh at the time. Now, the context in which he was born, we're looking at the early 13th century. So this is just as the Mongol invasions are happening. Now, that was very concerning for Sultan Bahauddin Walad. The Mongols were known, the Changizi Mongols were known to come into cities that they were invading, and it's not like, there were rules of war for them in that context at that time. It was very much so very, very brutal invasions. No one was spared. Women, children, the sick, the elderly, the plants, the animals, anything that they could destroy, they would destroy. It wasn't like, they came in, one took prisoners of war, maybe treated the prisoners nicely. Absolutely not. It was very vile, and there are historical accounts which we know of that they're absolutely terrifying to read. To imagine, that such destruction and carnage could be done from humans to other humans. Of course, they were not Muslims. Later, the invaders would convert to Islam in the coming centuries, but at the time they were not. And Sultan Bahauddin Walad, seeing the Mongol incursions, knowing that it was only a matter of time before they reached Balkh, massacred the population of Balkh, and that would include his family, he realized it was wise and prudent to perhaps move westward. Now, a little break from that, Mawlana Jalaluddin Rumi himself was a very bright young man, very bright young person, and in the early days when his father, who was a contemporary of our Sheikh Fariduddin Attar, for those who might not be familiar, Sheikh Fariduddin Attar is himself a Tasawufi, Irfani scholar, poet, and his most famous work being the Mantiq al-Tayr, known in English as the Conference of the Birds, or the Logos of the Birds. He encountered, he had met with Sultan Bahauddin Walad and noticed that a young Jalaluddin was there with him, and he noticed something in this young Jalaluddin. He told him, take good care of this young man. He's going to grow up to be someone very important, someone of real note. And with that, they set off. They went westwards, eventually settling in Konya, in present-day Turkey. So at that time, the city of Konya was really on the frontier lands of the Muslims and the Byzantine Christians. It's important to note that at this time, the Ottoman state did not exist. The Ottoman polity did not exist. Osman himself, who the Ottoman state is named after, was not even born at that time, or if he was, he would have been a young child. His father, the name of whom many of us might be familiar with, Ertugrul, I think probably in many households, we've seen the show, he was a contemporary of that time. So he was alive and he was doing his thing, but at that point there was no Ottoman state. There were some Turkic tribes in the area who had set up their own polities, but the main polity under which Konya existed was that of the Rum Seljuk Sultanate. So the Seljuk Sultanate, this was a Turkic dynasty. They were ruling in Iran, and then there was, to make a long history short, a splinter in Rum, in present-day Turkey, and it did not encapsulate all of present-day Turkey. As many of us are probably aware, Constantinople, now known as Istanbul, at that time had not been conquered again. The Ottoman state did not exist. The Ottoman polity did not exist. But the Rum Seljuk Sultanate was there, and they patronized Sultan Bahauddin Walad. They offered him and provided him with a salary to be the Sadr Mufti, the head scholar in the city. Again, we're talking about Mawlana Rumi today, but it's important to note that his father, in his own right, was a great scholar himself.
Hanafi faqih, because the Seljuks were also Hanafi, and they were the ones who first prioritized the Hanafi madhab as a state madhab, and because Balkh was primarily Hanafi, Maturidi. Mawlana Rumi's father, being a very well-known Hanafi Mufti, was brought in to establish Hanafiya, or the legal madhab of Abu Hanifa, within Konya.
Absolutely, yes, thank you for that. And so he's given this position, and he's there, and he sends off his young son Jalaluddin to go and study the Islamic sciences in Aleppo and in Damascus, and it's there that he becomes a scholar in his own right, familiar with and an expert in the sciences of Hadith, Quran, Tafsir, just really everything. I'm not going to do it justice, but please do feel free to jump in. Like, he studies all of the Islamic sciences himself and becomes a scholar renowned in his own right. And when he returns to Konya after the passing of his father, he takes over his position as the head mufti, as the head religious figure in the city of Konya. And this is really an interesting, or this is what makes Mawlana is his encounter with a specific person. Any guesses as to who that specific person may have been? Shout it out if you know. Okay, well, sorry? Not Imam Ghazali. It's a good guess. So actually, and I think we'll mention Imam Ghazali later, because he was, I believe, contemporaneous or at a similar time, but he meets a specific Shams al-Tabrizi. The name might be familiar with some folks, but he meets a specific Shams al-Tabrizi who really turns his world upside down. And in fact, if I may, I'll recite something that's been said. It said that Mawlawi hargiz nashud Mawlai Rum ta ghulam Shams al-Tabrizi nashud. The meaning of which would be that Mawlawi, or Mawlana Rumi, would never have become the Mawla of Rum, the place where he existed in Konya. He would have never become the Mawla of Rum had it not been for him becoming the ghulam of Shams al-Tabrizi.
Who was a Shafi'i scholar and contemporaneous with Imam Fakhruddin al-Razi in Tabriz.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And so this is of course a point of contention in the city. Mawlana is a very, very well-respected person, and now he's associating with Shams al-Tabrizi, who besides being Shafi'i in madhab, also is someone who does not perhaps appear as one would imagine the folks that Mawlana Rumi would be associating himself with. He's not someone in these beautiful robes and renowned and esteemed in the same way that the scholars would have been, but rather he's more darwishi in appearance. He's someone who mixes with the common folk. He's someone who perhaps could be seen as an outcast in society.
Yeah, I mean, I was just going to add that Imam Ghazali passes away in 1111. Imam Mawlana Rumi is born in 1207.
Mm-hmm, yes.
And we have to remember that Imam al-Ghazali, Qaddasallahu sirrahu al-Aziz, was the first scholar to really synthesize the worlds of fiqh and traditional Islamic learning and tasawwuf. And much of his life is really geared towards synthesizing that. Now, Imam Ghazali does it on on the highest plane, on the highest level. But obviously, for the world to catch up to Ghazali and to the Ghazalian project will take some time. And I think, as we will mention, the project of Mawlana Rumi is really a continuation and a continuity of Imam al-Ghazali, as many allusions in the Masnavi are made to Imam Ghazali's Ihya Ulumuddin. This is, these scholars, although Imam Ghazali has passed away almost 100 years ago, he has already become extremely famous. This is Iran, this is, Central Asia. His name is, extremely popular. So, although Imam Ghazali had done the work intellectually, on the ground, seeing faqihs sitting with the Sufis was not necessarily as common as people had necessarily seen before. So, Mawlana Rumi, although he's continuing Imam Ghazali's project, it's still very novel, as Sadwan has mentioned. But yeah,
absolutely. And so this adds to the sentiment of the people around Mawlana Rumi, even his own students, who are curious. Why is this great scholar, this Imam of ours, why is he associating with this Shams al-Tabriz? And they're bewildered to see this, but like I said, there's poetry about this as well, which we won't get into today, but how Mawlana's life was really turned upside down in meeting Shams. He and Shams go into a period of 40 days where they are secluded and go into a period of intense learning. So the chilla is a word we might be familiar with, right? Chilla literally meaning 40. They spend 40 days and 40 nights together in this period of just intense learning. And when Mawlana emerges from this period, he's a changed person. Before that, he wasn't, dealing with poetry. Poetry at the time, in fact, was primarily for panegyrists and writing odes to kings and things of that sort. So if you were a poet at the time, you might be patronized by the king or the sultan, and you would write something. If Mawlana Saleh was the sultan, I might say, what a great king, he's so great and generous and handsome and all of these great things, and he'd give me some money for that. This was the primary sort of mode in which people were writing poetry. There were, like I mentioned, Sheikh Fariduddin Attar and others who were writing spiritual poetry, but it wasn't necessarily the norm in which we understand it today, where someone's writing poetry, you might think, oh, this person's a very spiritual person. But so Mawlana, is now inspired, and he's reciting poetry. He didn't necessarily write it himself, but he would say what he was feeling. This inspiration had come to him, this ilham, and his students would write it down. And we have much of his writing, alhamdulillah, today. So the Masnavi, 6 volumes, we have that here with us today. The Masnavi itself is not his only piece of his body of work. He has his discourses, the Fihi Ma Fihi, as well as his Ghazaliyat, the Diwan al-Shams. But on the topic of the Masnavi, maybe I'll give a little bit of just explanation or shed a little bit of light as to what we're looking at. The Masnavi is a very respected text. It's uncommon for folks to touch open this book, much like the Quran, without having wuzu as a form of respect, and that's because it's actually referred to as the Quran in Farsi. Of course, this is not to be taken literally, but it's been said, Masnavi Mawlavi hast Quran dar zaban Pahlavi, nest payghambar wale darad kitab. Meaning the Masnavi of Mawlavi is the Quran in Pahlavi, the old word or the old language of Farsi, Middle Farsi. He says, Nais Payghambar, he's not a prophet, wale darad kitab, but he has a book. And so why is it known as the Quran in Farsi? It's not just some sort of hyperbole or something to make the book seem grander than it is, but rather there are direct references to the Quran in the Masnavi. So we won't cover necessarily direct words taken from the Quran, but they are in there. So I can give you an example. We have in the first section of the Masnavi, actually, there's a line related to love and Hazrat Musa alayhi salam, where the line says, Ish John Tur Ahmad Ashha, Tur Master Kharram Musa Sa'iha. So Hazrat Musa faints. I think actually, Mawlana Saleh, you know the exact line from the Quran.
فلما تجلى ربه للجبل جعله دكا وخر موسى صاعقا. So Mawlana Rumi takes that وخر موسى صاعقا and puts it in a rhyme with a Persian line, and his ability to do that is mind-blowing. I don't know if you mentioned that he quotes about 650 different Quranic ayat within meter. So he took Quranic ayat and put it within a Persian meter and rhymed it with Persian words. I mean, the ability to do that it's like if someone today wrote an English poetry book and rhymed Quranic verses with English lines,
And in addition to the actual references directly to the Quran, references, of course, to Hadith, about 400 or 600, maybe more references to the Hadith in the Masnavi. There are also countless allusions to Quranic stories, to Quranic passages, and directly to ayat, which actually we'll cover some of today. We'll see some of today. So, in a general sense, that's a very brief outline of Mawlana Rumi's life, his Masnavi, and I think inshallah we can jump into it. Like I said, we'll first have Mawlana Saleh read for us the original Persian, and then I'll read a translation for us, translated by Jawed Mujaddidi. Ustad Jawed Mujaddidi has also written his translation in rhyme and meter in English, so inshallah it'll help us understand what we're hearing, what we're listening to, and then we'll do a line-by-line commentary of the text. So without further ado, Mawlana.
Just one thing, I mean, there is no Iqbal without Mawlana Rumi. Iqbal makes this clear, especially in his Farsi poetry. In one line he says, Ay mutrib ghazali bayti az murshid rum awad taghut zanat janam dar atish tabrizi. O singer of ghazals, come bring a line from Mawlana Rum so that my soul can burn in the fire of Shams Tabriz. And so this idea is that Mawlana Rumi, 800 years later, within British India, within Lahore, was inspiring a poet like Iqbal, and we all know the joy that Iqbal has given us for 80 years, and that's really, really important to remember. شروع می کنیم به نام خداوند عزیز و خداوند آسمان و جهان و صلوات به حدود و به محدود بر پیغمبر عربی هاشمی قرشی علیه السلام و توسل می کنم از ارواح شادیان و ارواح با سعادت و با برکت و طلب می کنیم از خداوند که هر چه خیر و برکت آید از این قرائت بر روح مولانا روم و به ارواح امت سرگذشته به فرما بریسا و به بخشا انشاءالله. Bismillah, and we'll go ahead and start. So the first lines of his Masnavi, he says, بشنو از نی چو حکایت می کند از جدای ها شکایت می کند بشنو از نی چو حکایت می کند از جدای ها شکایت می کند کز نیستان تا مرا ببریده اند در نفیرم مرد و زن نالیده اند سینه خواهم شرح از فراق تا بگویم شرح درد اشتیاق هر کسی کو دور ماند از اصل خیش باز جوید روزگار وصل خیش من به هر جمعیت نالان شدم جفت بدحالان و خوشحالان شدم هر کسی از ظن خود شد یار من از درون من نجست اسرار من سر من از ناله من دور نیست سر من از ناله من دور نیست لیک چشم و گوش را آن نور نیست تن ز جان و جان ز تن مستور نیست لیک کس را دید جان دستور نیست آتش است این بانگ نای و نیست باد هر که این آتش ندارد نیست باد آتش عشق است که اندر نی فتاد جوشش عشق است که اندر می فتاد نی حریف هر که از یار برید پرده های ما درید همچون زهری و تریاقی که دید همچون دمساز و مشتاقی که دید نی حدیث راهی پرخون می کند قصه های عشق مجنون می کند محرمی هوش جز بیهوش نیست مر زبان را مشتری جز گوش نیست در غم ما روزها بیگاه شد روزها با سوزها همراه شد روزها رفت و گو رو باک نیست تو بمان ای آنکه چون تو پاک نیست هر که جز ماهی ز آبش سیر شد هر که بی روزیست روزش دیر شد در نیابد حال پختا هیچ خام پس سخن کوتاه باید و السلام.
Thank you for that brief recitation, Mawlana. So this is the first 18 lines of the Masnavi. I'll read them now, the English translation. Now listen to this reed flute's deep lament about the heartache being apart has meant. Since from the reed bed they uprooted me, my songs expressed each human's agony. A breast which separation split in two is what I seek to share this pain with you. When kept from their true origin, all yearn for union on the day they can return. Amongst the crowd alone I mourn my fate. With good and bad I've learned to integrate. That we were friends, each one was satisfied, but none sought out my secrets from inside. My soul's deepest secrets in this song I wail, but eyes and ears can't penetrate the veil. Body and soul are joined to form one whole, but no one is allowed to see the soul. It's fire, not just hot air, the reed flutes cry. If you don't have this fire, then you should die. Love's fire is what makes every reed flute pine. Love's fervor thus lends potency to wine. The reed consoles those forced to be apart. Its notes will lift the veil upon your heart. Where's antidote or poison like its song, or confidant, or one who's pined so long? This reed relates a tortuous path ahead, recalls with love with which Majnun's heart bled. The few who hear the truths the reed has sung have lost their wits so they can speak this tongue. The day is wasted if it's spent in grief, consumed by burning aches without relief. Good times have long passed, but we couldn't care. When you're with us, our friend beyond compare. While ordinary men on drops can thrive, a fish needs oceans daily to survive. The way the right must feel, the raw can't tell. My speech must be concise, and so farewell. Now, with that, we'll begin reading line by line and provide a little bit of commentary to hopefully elucidate what we're seeing, because it's easy to perhaps hear some of these things and hear the musicality, but it's really in the meaning. And each time I've read this, and you might agree, Mawlana, every time you read it, you gain something new from it. There's something to be taken away each time. So we'll begin from the very beginning. بشنو از نی چون حکایت می کند از جدایی ها شکایت می کند. It's important to note that a couple of things. Mawlana begins with the word bishnaw. Bishnaw means listen. It's a command. Listen, bishnaw. Now, the word bishnaw begins with be, right? The letter be. And we know that Bismillah also begins with be. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Knowing Mawlana Rumi's expertise in the fields of Islamic science, surely this isn't just some coincidence. We have to be cognizant of all of these things. So he starts with this Bismillah, and he says bishnaw. The very first word bishnaw. Now, he's telling us listen. He's going to tell us something he wants to listen. And if we recall the very first revelation that was sent down to our Prophet ﷺ, it was also a command. Iqra, read. Right? It was a command. And so here we're seeing a command, bishnaw. So you can see some of the parallels. Again, I mentioned, this Quran in Farsi is not just some hyperbole, right? There's a lot of layers behind all of this. And again, of course, it's not literal, but it's to be understood that there is a connection there. Bishnaw as nai, listen to the reed flute. A nai is a reed flute. Now, if you've seen a flute today, it's like usually made out of some sort of metal. I think it's steel, I'm not sure. But in the old days, or old classical flutes, nais, they were made from reeds, and some still are. So the reed grows in the reed bed. That'll be relevant in a moment here. But he says, listen to the reed flute as it tells a story, or as it tells a story. It complains of separations, and if anyone's familiar with the sound of a flute, you know that it's got a very sound. It can be quite melancholic and sad. So he said, listen, it's going to tell a story. It's going to tell a story of separations. It says, "Kaz Istan ta mara bubridaan, az nafiram mardozan nadidaan." Since they separated me, or really literally cut me, buridan is to cut. So since they cut me from the reed bed, men and women have been wallowing, have been exclaiming on account of my sorrow. Now, the reed bed, again, that's where the reeds grow, so the reed is plucked from there. He says, ever since I was plucked from the reed bed. Now, there are a couple of things that we can take from this. So it seems that early on we can identify Mawlana is referring to himself as a nai, as a flute, and he's going to tell a story. He's told us that in the first time. He's going to tell us a story of separations. When we think of a reed bed, if anyone has seen a reed bed, there's a lot of reeds just kind of sticking up. There's perhaps an allusion here to what in Farsi we call the Rose Alas, or some folks call the Hawle Bala, in which the Quranic story we know of, before anything was created, our souls were gathered in a primordial gathering in front of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And the Quran says, Alastu bi rabbikum, right? Am I not your Lord? And the humans testify, we say Bala, or today we would say Bale, meaning yes, we testify that you are indeed our Lord. This was really a very significant passage to note in the Quran. It's this test of when it says, "Am I not your Lord? Do you not testify?" On that day, in that gathering, at that time, in that placeless place, the human being accepted. We accepted the role of being sent down to the earth and tested with free will. Right? This challenge, or this opportunity was presented to the angels, to the mountains, to a lot of creation, and all of them rejected it. They did not want to take on this test, but the human being we know is honored above creation, above other creation, and accepted this test because it's of course through disobeying, or choosing not to disobey rather, and choosing to obey out of your own free will, that you really love something in the true sense of the word, right? If you can choose not to love something or to follow something that's been told to you, but you still do, that is a true expression of love. And so, again, he says here, so just getting back to the poem here, since I was cut from the reed bed, I've been wailing, and on account of my wailing and my sorrow, men and women, all of humanity has been wailing.
Yeah, if I could just add to that, Mawlana Rumi starts off with two themes. One is separation and one is grief. We know constantly in the Quran, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَإِلَيْنَا تُرْجَعُونَ, and you will come back to unite with us. We know that one of the last du'as of the Holy Prophet alayhi salatu wassalam was, Allahumma alhaqna bil-rafiq al-a'la, Allah join us with the highest friend. So this idea of union, of wisal, is so important to us as Muslims, Quranically, prophetically, and Mawlana Rumi is touching on this. The second thing is that the Holy Prophet said, Inna al-Qur'ana yunzalu bil-gham, that the Quran was descended with grief, right? And Mawlana Rumi is alluding to that hadith here, that truly, because we are separated from Allah in the dunya, not in the ukhra, not in the akhirah, but in the dunya, because we are separated from Allah, we are constantly in grief. And because we are not with Allah, who is our true beloved, and as he will allude to later, in the way that Majnun is separated from Layla and wants to be united with Layla, so too us as human beings, we just want to be with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The Holy Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam in another hadith in Bukhari said, Al-arwahu junudun mujannada, faman iqtanasa minha iqtanasa fiha, ومن اختلف منها أو في حديث آخر ومن تناكر منها تناكر فيها. Right, that souls were like garrisons in Alam al-Arwah, and this is Bukhari hadith. Souls were like garrisons in the world of souls. Whomsoever you get along with there, so too will you get along with here. This is the Holy Prophet, as-Sadiq al-Amin, alayhi salatu wassalam. Right? And Mawlana Rumi is again alluding to all of, because he is someone who has studied the tradition so phenomenally, right? And is able to extract so many themes just in a couple of lines, right? And for us to truly understand just these three themes of separation, union, and grief, right? I think it was Iqbal who said that, as a Muslim, their task in this world is to contend with grief of the Ummah, right? Grief of separation, the grief of angels, right? And we know how many ahadith where the Holy Prophet or the Sahaba, there is tears, there is weeping, there is lamentation, right? And this is not to say that we reject the taqdeer of Allah, right? But again, we come back to the hadith of the Holy Prophet, Inna al-Qur'ana nuzila bil-huzn, or nuzila bil-gham. The Quran was descended with grief, right? And it's important for us to acknowledge it head on, as Mawlana teaches us. Anyways, he says, Sina khaham sharha az firaq, ta baguyam sharh dard ishtiyaq, that I want a chest that is torn from separation. Sharha az firaq. We'll talk about how he plays on the Arabic word of sharh here. Sina khaham sharha az firaq. I want a chest that is torn apart from separation, right? Ta baguyam sharh dard ishtiyaq. Why? So I can do sharah, so I can do commentary of the grief or the pain of yearning, right? So that if my chest is torn away or torn apart from the separation of Allah, only then can I explain to someone what is that grief of someone who wants to close up his chest and return to Allah. وَإِلَيْنَا تُرْجَعُونَ, right? And this he puns or word plays on the word sharha, which can mean commentary or it can mean split open, because that's what you're doing in a commentary, right? You're splicing open the book, you're splitting open the book. And Mawlana Rumi, being an incredible expert both in Arabic and Persian, is playing on both, right? And this is so important to remember, right? Is that, are we cognizant of our separation from Allah? And this idea of وَهُمْ عَنْهَا غَافِلُونَ, as Allah says in the Quran, they are ignorant. What are they ignorant of? Right? That وَإِلَيْنَا تُرْجَعُونَ, that there will be a union, that you are only living in separation for a short while, and that a Muslim is someone who can recognize the fact that he is in separation. That union will not happen in this world. There is no Layla in this world, right? But that union, that visal, that ruju' ilallah will happen in the akhirah, but you can still acknowledge the fact that you are separated, and this is where ishq begins. This is where love begins, right? That you acknowledge that you are separated from the presence, from the hudur of Allah. And as we mentioned earlier, the great poet Muhammad Iqbal, on the 5th chapter of Reconstruction of Religious Thought in Islam, quoted the great Chishti Sufi Abdul Quddus Kangohi rahimahullah. He says, Payghambar ba haft asman raft wa baz amad, agar may ravam baz na amadam. He says that the Holy Prophet traversed the 7 heavens and he came back. That he met Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala qaba qawsayn, but he came back. If I had gone, I would have never been able to come back. After union, how can you come back here? And that's what makes him a prophet. That he can suffer that separation deliberately from Allah. And this is not to say that he was ever separated from Allah in that sense, but clearly there's a separation in this world versus the akhirah, right? And this separation that our holy prophet himself, probably would have experienced every single day. Should I do the next line too?
Yeah, the next line. Just maybe one thing I want to point out. So we did mention there are allusions to the Quran. You covered a whole lot there, Mullah said, but also, Sina khaham sharha as firaq, right? This is actually almost a translation from the Quran. It's right from itself, right?
Alam nashrah laka sadrak. He's translating Alam nashrah laka sadrak here.
Yeah, Alam nashrah, right? It's the same root, sharh, Alam nashrah laka sadrak, and sadr meaning
your chest.
Your chest.
Sina.
Same word. So there's a lot of layers. So we could literally spend the rest of the night doing tafsir of that one ayah, I think. But just to point that out. So yes, please, with the next line.
Yeah. هر کسی کدور ماند از اصل خویش باز جوید روزگار وصل خویش. Everyone who is far from his asl khish, apne asl say, who is far from his asl, origin, right? Baz juyad ruzgar wasl khish, wishes that he could return back home. Doesn't everyone want to go back home, right? And this is what the Quran is teaching us. Go back home, right? You are going to return home. And I think in another line, Mawlana says, manzalema firdosas, right? That yare marak budaim, that you and I used to be friends of the angels. Baz haman jar ravim ke an shahr mas, that soon you and I will go home, because firdos hamari purana ghar hai. It's our old home, right? And the Quran is telling you that let's go home. Recognize that you are going home, right? And here, baz juyad ruzgar wasl khish. Anyone, any average intellect person who's separated from his home wants to go back home. Who doesn't want to go back home? Right? This idea of home being a source of warmth, of being a source of joy, and being a remover of grief, right? And that as a Muslim, right, to seek that asl, which is, what is the asl except for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right? And Mawlana Rumi, as you said earlier, he said that this is, هذه أصول الدين. This is the principles of the principles of the principles of the principles of religion, right? Which is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. What else could we want or desire other than to go back home, right? Don't they, as we know in the Hadith of Sahih Muslim, the Holy Prophet ﷺ says that the highest honor that a believer will have is didar khudawan, is to witness Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Ila rabbiha nadira, right? Surah Qiyamah, ila rabbiha nadira, right? So, and this idea is that Mawlana Rumi, in a very different language, in an incredible register of Farsi, in which the level of Farsi here, no Muslim or non-Muslim Iranian poet or Afghan poet, I don't think has ever matched this, right? So thinking about how you take Islamic values and you take the highest register of that language and you put it in there and see what happens, see how people react to it.
Yeah.
Right? See how people react when you take the highest form of any language in the world and you are a master of that language and you put Islamic values into it. But yeah, please.
Yeah, there's a lot we could get into there, but we might risk getting a little bit off topic. So yeah, I'll continue. I think it leads in quite well to what we have here on the next line. It says, "Man bahar jam'iyate nalan shudam, juft badhalan و خوشحالان شدم. هر کسی از زن خود شد یار من، از درون من نجست اسرار من." So he says in the first part there, he says, "Man bahar jam'iyate nalan shudam." I went into and entered, in this state of sorrowfulness, many different gatherings, many different jamiyat. Juft badhalan و خوشحالان شدم. I sat together. I became one with those who are khoshhal and those who are badhal, those who are in a good state and those who are in a bad state. There's a lot we can get into there as to what that means. But saying that he's taken his message here, what he has to say, and he's brought it to many different gatherings. He sat with those who were happy and those who were sad, perhaps those who recognize what they need, the khoshhal and the badhal, those who aren't aware of this reality. But he says, "Har kasi az zann khud shud yar man." He says, everybody became, on their false assumptions, they became my yar, they became a friend of mine. a close associate of mine. As darun man najos asrar man, or this can also be read as darun man najas asrar man. We won't get too deep into different meanings tonight, but he says these people, they all assumed incorrectly that they were my yard, they were close to me, but they did not seek out from within me my asrar, my secrets. So again, we could read this at a surface level. We could have been done by now, the entire poem. We could have mentioned a couple of things, but there are layers. He's saying they didn't look inside of me to see what my secrets were. You know, they didn't look further beyond the surface level to try to understand what it is. And then he says right after that,
سر من از ناله من دور نیست لیک چشم و گوش را آن نور نیست تن ز جان و جان ز تن مستور نیست لیک کس را دید جان دستور نیست. So he says that my secret, سر من, my secret, is not far from my complaint or my lament. لیک چشم و گوش را آن نور نیست. But your eyes and your ears don't have the light to see. Right? And this is the idea, you know, Allah says in the Quran, الَّذِينَ يَعْرِفُونَهُ كَمَا يَعْرِفُونَ أَبْنَاءَهُم. They knew the Holy Prophet's truth like they knew their own sons. وَلَكِنْ نَجْرُسْ أَسْرَارِ پَيْغَمْبَرٍ. They never sought the secrets of the Prophet. Right? So this idea of what are the secrets? Right? And so to see with light, right? To view something with light opens up a different reality. And this is what Mawlana Rumi wants to turn people towards, is that how do you view things with light? How do you view things with an inner eye? You know, in another place he says, Admi didas baqi postas. Didan bashad kadide dostas. Right? That man is all but vision. And what is that vision except the vision of the friend or the beloved? Right? And then later on he says, Tan zajan o jan zatan mastur needs. Body is not veiled from the soul. Right? The body intimately knows that there is a soul in it. Obviously, when the soul leaves, the body dies. What John Zatan Masturnis, neither is the soul unaware that it's inhabiting a body. They're both aware of each other's reality. Our souls and our bodies are in a dialogue with each other. Right? Lake Kasra di de John Dasturnis. Yet nobody is allowed to see the soul. Right? So again, it's this light, right? As you know, the dua of the Holy Prophet, Allahumma ja'al ayni nura. Allahumma ja'al ayni nura. What's the meaning of this dua? Oh Allah, turn my eyes into light. Turn my eyes into light, right? So that we can see the secrets. And, you know, as Mawlana Rumi has taught us, what are Muslims but carriers of the secrets of this light? فَلَمَّا تَجَلَّى رَبُّهُ لِلْجَبَلِ جَعَلَهُ. When Allah manifested, when did his tajalli on the mountain, خَرَّ مُوسَى صَعِقًا. Musa alayhi salam fell down, behosh.
Yes, Mawlana Salih is always getting really deep in it. I'm just going to say just one thing. So he says, Sir man as nalay man durnes, and then in the other part he said, Tan zejon John zetan masturnes, right? So as Mawlana said, the tan, the body, and the John, the soul, are not separated from one another, right? I'm sitting here, we're all sitting here. We all know that, you know, you have a body and you have a soul. They're not hidden. I can see your body and I can sense your soul. I know that you have a soul. And then Lake Kasra di the John Dastunis, but not everyone or no one can see the soul, right? We can't actually see the soul. We know it's here, but we can't see it. And similarly, Sirraman as Nalay Mandurnes, this idea of the body and the soul being together, he says his sir and his nala are not far from one another. His secret and his lamentation are not far from one another. So his secret lies in his lamentation, in his words, in what he's telling us. But it cannot be seen. Right? So it's there, it's one. When we hear his words, when we recite the Masnavi, when we hear his message, when we hear the sound of the flute, we're being exposed directly to the secret, and yet it's hidden from us, it's veiled from us, it's behind the veil, so we can't actually see or understand it, right? The Nur also in classical times, that was a very deep analysis of it. Thank you. I would just add that in classical times, you know, modern science tells us differently today, but in classical times we understood that the eye had a light, it had a nur, right? And it's with that nur that you see. And when the lights of your eyes go out, that's when one would become actually blind, right? So in Farsi, you know, we have a term of endearment. We say someone is nur chashmeman, right? The nur of my eyes. We say the apple of the eye in English. I don't know what apples have to do with eyes, but you know, the nur chashme was the light of my eye. And so when that light disappears, you become blind. You can't see, right? There's a lot more we get into. Like you mentioned, I thought that was a beautiful tashkhis of it. But if we were to go to the next part, he says, آتش است این بانگ نای و نیست باد هر که این آتش ندارد نیست باد آتش عشق است کاندر نیفتاد جوشش عشق است کاندر می فتاد. So he says, آتش است این بانگ نای. The cry or the sound of this nai, the bong nai, it's not wind. Neist bad, it's not wind. You blow into a flute, right? It's wind that you're producing. But he says it's not wind, it's fire. آتش است. هر که این آتش ندارد نیست باد. Whoever doesn't have this آتش, may he cease to be, may he die, may he not be. Right? So a very, very interesting way to sort of put things. آتش است این بانگ نای و نیست باد. One thing to notice about آتش, we might not be very thoughtful to this, that we all kind of know it in the back of our minds today because we use microwaves and stuff to cook. But what does آتش do, right, in chemistry and cooking and these things? It purifies. آتش purifies. Fire purifies. And he says that this is not wind. Don't see it on the surface level. On the surface level, the sound of the flute is just wind. But he's saying this is not wind. This is آتش. It's fire. This will purify you. This will cleanse you. Right? هر که این آتش ندارد نیست باد. Whoever doesn't possess this آتش, may he not be, may he die. And what is he saying when he's saying, may you die? He's not literally cursing you and saying, go die. But it's this purification, right? The death of the lower self, of the nafs, this suppression of the lower self, the purification of the self. May you not be, so that you can actually gain that atash, you can see the or feel the atash and not understand it as just wind. Atash ishq ast kandar naifetad. He says the atash which goes into the naif is the fire of love. And Mawlana Sabi touched upon the theme of love quite a bit earlier. So it's that fire of love which goes into the naif. It's the boiling of love that is what goes into the wine, right? So if we think about this just from a chemistry perspective for a second, wine, what does it do? Well, it intoxicates you, right? And how does it intoxicate you? It's through a process of fermentation. And in order for this also to happen, there's a boiling associated with that, right? So he's saying, it's what? It's the boiling of love that gives wine the characteristic that it has. So there's this intensity around fire and around boiling that we get to. And we're going to touch on it a little bit more here. But Mawlana, if you have anything to add.
Yeah, no, I think you covered it, yeah. Are you doing that? Okay, yeah.
نه حریف هر که از یاری برید پرده هایش پرده های ما درید همچونه زهری و تریاقی که دید همچونه دمساز و مشتاقی که دید. That the reed is the comrade or the friend of everyone who has been separated. That the reed then becomes the only friend. پرده هایش پرده های ما درید. Its strains or its notes, parda can mean both veil and note, it has cut our own hearts, right? And so this idea is that how the reed flute, right? Then because of its ability to complain, its ability to lament. Also one thing we forgot to mention earlier on is that the word nay, or the word to cut, in Arabic, Allah alludes to in the Quran, الَّذِي عَلَّمَهُ بِالْقَلَمِ. The word qalam in Arabic actually means to cut. So Mawlana Rumi is making an allusion because in the old days you had the reed pen. You guys remember you had to cut the reed and it would produce a pen. So this again, this idea of cutting. And so because the nay has also been separated from its root, then it becomes the one who can bear ghamsaz or a damsaz, one who understands us, one who breathes with us, right? And pardahayish pardahay ma darid, right? That its notes or its strains have pierced our own veils. That the nay, i.e. Mawlana Rumi is talking about himself, right? The metaphor of the nay is Mawlana Rumi. He is piercing through our own hearts or the veils, right? That we have put upon our own hearts, right? Hamchune zahri wa teriyaqi kadib. Whoever saw a poison or teriyaq, an antidote, like the nay, that it can either poison you, it can lead you astray, or it can cure you. Hamchune damsazu mushtaqi kadid. Whoever saw a sympathizer and a lover, a mushtaq, one who yearns like the nay, right? So this idea again that we are all sort of this name, right? We are all this reed, we're separated from our source, wailing to return home. And I think we had mentioned before. No.
So there are a couple of things. So the word harif here can mean the opponent or it can mean the comrade, right? He says the nai is the opponent or the comrade. Just note that there's a double meaning there of he who is separated from his yar, har ki az yari buri, pardahayash pardahay madari. On the topic of atash we were talking about earlier, fire. Today when you make a flute, you drill the holes, or there's some mechanical process of doing it, but how it was done in the old days was actually with fire. So if you're familiar with the anatomy of a flute, it will have holes, right? Those are the pardaha, those are the notes of the flute. It had to be burned, right? So you would have something like a match and you would burn it. And that's what allows it to make noise, right? To make like a song. If it doesn't have those holes, those pardas, you're just going to blow into it. It's just one sound that comes out. And he says, so pardahayash pardahaya madari. So the notes of the night, the message, the song of the night, right? That is what ripped our veils. It rent our veils. So what is this veil? This is the veil of separation between us and the divine reality. Right? He's saying the message of the night. Again, he's elucidating, alluding to that it's the sound of the night, the message of the night, that which lies underneath the surface level is going to actually take us beyond these veils to the next level. And then just really quickly on a literary standpoint, some things I'd like to mention here. Zahru taryaq, right? So we mentioned harif can mean friend or opponent. Zahr is poison, taryaq is antidote. So you see this juxtaposition of two opposite meanings in one word, and then also in Zahru taryaq, the parda and the parda, and then again in the damsaz and the mushtaq, right? Here's where translations really only take you so far. We have to understand that mushtaq is the one who yearns, right? It's related to the word shawq, right? A passion, a yearning. And a damsaz means a couple of things. Here in this context, it's a partner, but a damsaz, so it's something that you could use to refer to one's partner, one's spouse. You see this in like damsaz. It's made from literally two words, dam, meaning breath, and saz, one like make, from soft dam to make. So the damsaz, the one who makes breath, or makes, dam can also mean moment. So the one who will live with you, bear with you in certain moments, that's your damsaz. Kind of like, I think hamza might be used as well. But so this damsaz and then this mushtaq. Again, a juxtaposition there between the damsaz, the mushtaq. And then of course, dam, like I said, means breath as well. The damsaz is the one who makes the breath. And he just spoke of what the breath that goes into the flute is what produces the sound, right? Now, perhaps there's something to be said here about who is this damsaz, and this comes later in the poem, but who is this damsaz who's blowing into this flute that is Mawlana, right? Now, like we said earlier, right? He's not a prophet, that's not what we're saying, but there is this divine inspiration that is bringing Mawlana to say these words, which he has this message to share with us, right? So he's saying that there's this damsaz who's giving me these words, I'm sharing with you, there's a message, you have to look behind the veils to understand it. In the next line he says, Nay hadith rah porkhun mekunad, qissa hay ishq majnoon mekunad. Nay hadith rah porkhun mekunad. The night tells the hadith, the story of the rah porkhun, the path filled with blood. Qissa hay ishq majnoon mekunad. It tells qissa, it's a story, it tells the stories of Ishq Majnoon. Majnoon, Laylan Majnoon, of course, but Majnoon literally means crazy, right? So Majnoon's name.
One who's possessed by a jinn.
One who's Majnoon, jinn, right? So yes, Junoon, Junal. So, Majnoon's name, Laylan Majnoon's name was not actually Majnoon. That's what people called him, one who was possessed by jinn, one who was crazy, because he was so crazy in love. His actual name was Qais, right? But so here you're saying, it tells the stories of this crazed, this possessed love, right? The rahib porkhun. If you're going to go on this path, you're going to have to be ready to sacrifice, right? You're going to have to shed blood. You're going to have to deal with this insane passion, this love. He says, "Mahrami in hosh juz behosh neist, mar zaban ra mushtari juz gosh neist." He says, no one is privy to this hosh, to this thoughtfulness, this consciousness rather. He says no one is privy or knows of this consciousness but the behosh, the one who does not have any consciousness, right? And who else is behosh? The one who has drunk the wine, right? We say he's madhosh or behosh. He does not have consciousness. And if you've ever seen somebody who's been drunk, you know that there's really not a consciousness about them. They're in a different state, right? Of course, we're not talking about literal drunkenness and literal wine here, but we have to take these and understand the metaphorical meaning. We're talking about a spiritual one, a spiritual drunkenness, a love for God. And he's saying that no one understands this consciousness which he's speaking of, this love, this divine reality, this message. No one understands it except for the one who has lost his senses, who has become so majnoon, so in love, who has taken this rah-e-purkhun, this difficult path, and gotten to this point where now he understands it. You have to lose yourself to fully understand it. He's saying, Mar zaban ra mushtari juz gosh neist. He's asking a rhetorical question here. He says, for the zaban, for the tongue, there's no client, there's no customer but the ear. And so similarly, it's just a continuation of that idea that the only one who's going to understand this, the only one who's going to understand the zaban is the gosh, the ear. You know, if everybody just didn't have ears and there was a tongue, who would hear what the tongue has to say? There's nothing, right? And so similarly here, no one understands this hosh, no one understands this consciousness except for the one who is so deeply in love and has lost himself to this ishq majnoon and taken this rah-e-purkhun.
Yeah, and you know, I would just add this idea of rah-e-purkhun, or full of blood, right? It's that when you have done so much qurbani, when you have done so much sacrifice, as you said, of the lower self or the bahimiya or the animal self, you literally scatter blood, but that allows for new life, right? So, but you have to be willing to sacrifice the blood of your shahawat, of your khahishat, right? And this is what Mawlana Rumi is alluding to, that if you really seek this path, if you really seek that union with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, you must be ready to metaphorically spill blood, but you spill the blood of yourself, right? Again, not literally.
Even literally, right? And perhaps, you know, inshallah doesn't apply to us here, but if you think of the story or the life of the Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him, you know, he bled in the way of Allah, right? He was stoned, he was driven out of, was it Taif? He was driven out by the people when he tried to deliver the message of Islam, right? He could have called it quits. He bled, he was walking back. If I recall correctly, I do hope I'm not misspeaking, but there was blood, like stained his clothes, his shoes. He was bleeding, quite literally, not quite, very literally. He was bleeding, yet he stuck on this path. Why? Because of the love of God. Ultimately, it's that ishq majnoon, the love that he had for God that kept him going, right? So there is a literal, I think, sense to this as well. And like I said, inshallah, it doesn't apply to us. Hopefully, no one's dealing with anything like that, especially not here. You know, I know Islamophobia is on the rise out here in the United States. It is in Canada too, but inshallah, that's not the case. But there is also a literal meaning too, right? You have to sacrifice not just inwardly, but also outwardly. We see it in the life of our Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him, and we can equate it to our own lives through the inner sacrifices that we have to make.
Yeah. در غم ما روزها بیگاه شد، روزها با سوزها همراه شد. That in our grave, our days have become without time. Gah can either mean evening, so they have become without. Our days have no evenings. It's as if it's just this long, eternal, insufferable day, or it's as if there's no more time. That when you sort of understand that union, when you gain that love of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, time loses its meaning, right? You don't really feel the passing of time. And we can think of the hadith of India, لا تسب الدهر فإن الله هو الدهر, right? That don't curse time because Allah himself is time. The hadith in Abu Dawood. روزها با سوزها همراه شد. That our days with our burning griefs have become friends, right? That you have been willing and able to carry on the grief of perhaps the rah-e-purkhun or another type of sacrifice, and that you're willing to live out your days with these griefs, right? That you're willing to live out these days with this blazing grief within you, right? Rozha garrat go robak nis. If the days go, that's okay. Robak nis, that's no problem. It is no matter. Tu babon ay on kichu tu pak nis. But you stay, because no one is as holy as you are. Referring to, you know, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right? That let everything else go, let everything else slip away and go into extinction. But oh Allah, you stay, because, you know, and obviously this is a reference to, you know, the Quranic verse in Surah Rahman, right? That nothing else stays except for wajhu rabbik, the countenance of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And thinking about this, right? That
when you step onto this path, there is, blood, as you said, metaphorical or literal, as Farah said, and there is grief, right? But the fact that the end goal is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala makes all of it worth it. The fact that the maqsad is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and gaining that makes this whole path, worth it. And you can see like the musicality, right? Rozha, basozha, hamra shud. That all of your days with all of its griefs come together as one and they pass together.
And if I could add to that, so for those familiar with tasawwuf, the idea is that the Ahl tasawwuf, the Sufi is Ibn al-Waqt, right? He is the son of time. And we'll see it in the next line here as well. But the idea is that, you don't think about the future, you don't think about the past. The focus is on right now. And this, rozha, basozha, hamra shud, our days or our time, we don't have to think of it just as days, but our time, right? Like literal serial time became one. Hamra shud, basozha, with our pains, with our aches, our pains, our misery, right? To make a much more real life, literal example, of brothers who go to the gym, you're doing a plank for a minute. You know that you're not thinking about the next minute, you're not thinking about the moment that passed. All you can focus on with that pain is that very moment and holding your form, keeping it consistent, right? That is the pain of the Sufi, the lover of God. The pain is that of that moment, that you cannot focus on what's ahead, you cannot focus on what's behind, you're not concerned with what's ahead and what's behind. It's only that moment that matters. He says that our time became like no time, like Mawlana said here, our time became like no time, right? It became like one continuous sort of time. There's no future and past, and it became one with our pains. He says here in the next line, هر کی جز ماهی ز آبش سیر شد هر کی بی روزیست روزش دیر شد. Right? So he says, هر کی جز ماهی ز آبش سیر شد. He says, everybody became quenched. Their thirst became quenched except for the mahi, the fish. Right? Now think about a fish. Can a fish survive without water? No, but we can, right? If I drink enough water, I'm like, that's enough. I literally cannot take anymore. I'm done. But the mahi, the Sufi is like the mahi, right? You need water at all times. Your only focus is on having that water. As soon as you don't have it, it's not gonna work for you anymore. He says here, the next line was, whoever does not have provisions, again, wordplay here on the word roz, rozi means provisions or rest. He who does not have rest or does not receive his rozi, his rest, his day will become long, right? We've experienced this perhaps when we're fasting. We know that the day might seem to pass very long when you don't have that food, it doesn't come to you, right? Rozi, it had to be rozi, again. And I don't want to make this all about planking and the gym, but you imagine it's that very moment, that's what you're concerned with. When you're hungry, you're fasting, you haven't received your rest for the day yet, you're not thinking about, sure, you might be thinking about iftar time, maghrib, but you're not really. You're thinking about right now. You're concerned with this very moment, right? So, har ki juz mahi ze abash ser shud, har ki be rozis, rozash der shud. And then we'll end with this line. He says, that.
If I could just add
Please.
to that. Yeah. So, har ki juz mahi, the word mahi can also be from the word ma, which means moon. Mahi would be one moon. And we know that the reflection of the moon into water is a very beautiful reflection. And there's almost like a loving relationship between the reflection of the moon into water. So another way I think which would be really beautiful to add is like right? That whoever is not a moon, would become satisfied with water. But if you are a moon, seeing that relationship between the reflection of the moon into water then becomes something very beautiful. But yeah, I just wanted to add that.
Yeah, no, I hadn't even thought of it like that before. And there's, perhaps even another layer, maybe something to be said about water and tides and the gravitational pull of the moon. I'm not sure, but yeah, maybe something to take offline later. He says here, در نیابد حال پخته هیچ خام پس سخن کوتاه باید و سلام. So you end sort of here, this section, the poem goes on, but we'll end at this section. He says, در نیابد حال پخته هیچ خام. He says that pukhta means ripe or cooked. Kham means unripe or uncooked. He says, no unripe or no kham will ever understand or reach the hal, the state of the pukhta, right? The unripe will not understand the ripe. Pas sukhan bayat kotah bayat wa salam. So he says, so you have to keep the speech short, wa salam. farewell, you know? And there's I think quite a bit to unpack there. Firstly, this idea we said of atash, right? Of cleansing, of purifying, and of course of cooking, right? If you have not gone through that atash-e-ishq, right? If you have not gone through that fire of love, if you've not gone through that rahib-purkhun, if you have not struggled in the way of God, you're not going to be pukhta, you're not going to be right. You're going to remain unripe and kham. And you will never understand the hal, the state of the pukhta, right? And when the next line here, "Pasukhan kotah bayad wa salam," what do you do when someone doesn't understand you, right? I mean, there's a famous saying that I forget who said this, but he said, "Bring me, 1,000 wise men, and I will refute them all. Bring me one fool, and I'll lose every single time." Right? You can't argue with someone who does not understand you, who's not on that same plane or level of understanding. And so he's saying the pukhta will not understand the kham will not understand the pukhta. Right? So he says, so what must you do? You have to keep the speech short. Wassalam, right? Wassalam. This is powerful as well. There's a Quranic injunction here, right? Mawlana said, I think I don't want to misquote. But the Ibad Rahman, when they come face to face with those who do not believe or do not understand, what do you say to them? They want to debate you, they want to debate you. Salam. That's right. You don't. There you go. That's exactly it. So he's saying here, again, just to summarize that the pukhta is different. It's someone who has gone through this ripening, this process of cooking, right? If we think of meat becomes pukhta. When it goes through fire, it is purified, it is cleansed. You know that meat has all sorts of bacteria, germs on it. When it gets cooked, it becomes purified. Fire purifies, right? He says that the pukhta and the kham are different. The kham will never understand the pukhta. And when you come across someone who is kham, you gotta keep it short. You gotta say salam. And perhaps this is something being said even to us. We should not think of ourselves too highly to think that perhaps we've understood everything there is to understand in this poem. Right? He says I have to keep it short. You folks perhaps are not going to understand. Of course, not all of you. Speaking of myself here, but there's a lot to be said there about keeping things succinct, short, and of course the fire of love, the message of the Masnavi being a fire to purify us, to make our souls purified and clean.
Yeah, and then again, I would just add for the previous line that in the same way that a mahi constantly needs water, or a fish needs water to survive, someone who truly loves Allah or is lost in the love of Allah needs the love of Allah to survive. And in the way that when a fish is out of water, it's constantly thinking about hopping back or skipping back into water, the person who has purified himself and connected himself or herself to Allah is constantly thinking about, how do I bring myself closer to Allah? And many of the ahadith, many of the Quranic verses can be pinpointed simply on this thought and on this reflection of that we are fish out of water, and we need to shift our attention, which will happen through rahib-purkhun, pukhtagi, and these other themes, and to think about where every single moment of your life is rooted and is based on this idea of where can I find Allah, where can I connect myself to Allah, how can I love Allah, and most importantly, when do I get to go back home to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But I think we can end there, inshallah.
We can end there, perhaps.
Yeah. We'll take two or three questions, then we'll end with the dua, inshallah. If anybody has anything to ask. Thank you, so much, Waris, for coming all the way from Toronto and doing such a wonderful explanation.
Thank you for having me.
To have you. Very
It's my
honored.
pleasure.
Yeah.
The word you said for spouse themselves, how do you say that? How do you write that?
Dal, Mim, Dam, and then Saz, Sin, Aleph, Zay. Dam Saz. So the word Dam and the word Saz put together. Dam Saz, it could be like a spouse. It's not common to call your spouse like a Dam Saz so much, but it could be understood in that sense like a partner. Dam meaning moment, as well as meaning breath, right? And what are moments but breaths, right? So the one who makes with you in those moments, who will make do with you in those moments, who will be with you, and then it can also be read right in the context of the one who literally makes the breath for the food here. Any other questions? Yes, brother.
Do you guys have a take on why Rumi is so popular in English, and why his translations have been butchered and all the Islamic references removed?
Yeah, I can. You should also jump in too.
Yeah.
But there's no doubt when you read through so much of the Masnavi, of the beauty of it, right? And the person who translated it, Coleman Barks, who made it popular, he thought that if he kept in the Islamic references to prophets or to Allah or to resurrection, it wouldn't sell and it wouldn't be appetizing to non-Muslims in America. So that's definitely, I think he's actually mentioned that in interviews, and he said that it's not about the actual words or the content of the Masnavi, it's about what he thought was the message. And as we see that had, I wanted to mention one thing, that if the Rumi that you buy at Barnes & Noble is probably 1% or 0.5% of Mawlana. And Mawlana Rumi has been, New York Times bestseller in America for 20 years, I think overtaken by Rupi Kaur. But if just 1% of Mawlana had such an impact on America, imagine if people knew 50% of what that could do to them. The fact that so many different, yoga collectives or spiritual or meditation retreats are all function around just Rumi as a mistranslated Muslim poet. Imagine if we could just show 20% of Mawlana, what that would do to people, right? Just 20%. If Americans only have 1% and became the best-selling poet in America through translation, imagine if we could show 20%.
Yeah, I would just add, the message of Mawlana Rumi is really the message of Islam. It's the message of the Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him. And we know that, the Prophet Muhammad was, not rahmatul lil muslimin, right? He was rahmatul lil alameen, right? He was for the world, and he was a mercy for everyone. So the message really is universal, but like Mawlana said here, the idea was to, make it attractive to the average American consumer. Coleman Barks himself, actually doesn't know Farsi. He would read the translated version by Nicholson of Mawlana's Masnavi, and then when I think he was inspired or like he'd have dreams, when he felt the inspiration, based off what he would read, he would then interpret and write his own version. So, I think it's unfair even to call it a translation. It's more an interpretation, if anything. But yes, the core idea behind it was to sell, and to make it attractive to and digestible for the general American public, and explicit references then to Islam, to the Prophet, to God, peace and blessings be upon the Prophet and his family, would have been unattractive. So it was to be removed, and that was the primary motivator. It worked, it sold, and different folks have different opinions as to whether this was good or whether it was bad. But it's I think fair to say that those who are only familiar with Mawlana Rumi through the works of Coleman Barks are hardly familiar with Mawlana Rumi, right? He said here, I sat in many gatherings and my message was shared with many of these people, and many of them thought that they were my yar, they were my friend, my close companion. But he says that very few of them sought out my secrets from me. And actually the other reading, Justan, or Jastan, he's saying my secrets did not come out from me with these people, right? You have to be able to receive the message that he's sharing with you. You have to be ready for that. That's why he says, Nazed bought to the person who doesn't possess this fire, right? May they not be, because they're not going to understand. And in fact, even later he says here, I won't read the actual line in Farsi, but to summarize it, he says, if you were to take a jug and if you were to fill it with the ocean, how much would actually fit in that jug? Well, only the amount that the jug can hold, right? You cannot pour the ocean into a jug. It's not going to work. So, the folks who are only familiar with Mawlana Rumi through that context, I think have perhaps, filled their jug with a very, Mawlana's an ocean. They filled a very small jug, and I would hope that anyone who's read those translations looks deeper and reads, more accurate translations and perhaps even in the original language if they have that capacity, because there's really so much more than what's been presented to the American public at large. It's a fantastic question. Any other questions?
I think, yeah, we'll end there, inshallah. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Allahumma salli ala Sayyidina wa sanadina wa rasulina wa habibina Muhammad. Allahumma anta as-salam wa minka as-salam wa ilayka ya'udu as-salam wa salli ya al-jalali wal ikram. Allahumma rabbana ighfir lana wa ikhwanina alladhina sabaquna bil iman wa la taj'al fi qulubina ghillan lil ladhina amanu rabbana innaka ra'ufur rahim. We ask you, O Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that whatever khair or whatever barakah came out, we ask you to send it as a form of reward on behalf of Mawlana Rumi. And we ask you, O Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, to help us to do justice to his work and his thought, and spread, most importantly, the message of Islam in this land through beauty and through joy. Wa sallallahu ala Sayyidina wa sanadina wa rasulina Muhammad bi rahmatika ya arhamar rahimin. Jazakallah khair. Thank you so much for everyone for coming. Thank you, Waris, for doing all of that for us. And, looking forward to see you guys next month for Aurangzeb. Adam Giri, inshallah.
Jazakallah khair. Assalamu alaikum.